Joining me with reaction, the author of The Greatest Comeback, Patrick J. Buchanan, is with us. Pat, shouldn't it be a prerequisite that Iran stops being the #1 state sponsor of terror, that they stop saying that it's non-negotiable, Israel's destruction, and that they stop saying death to America before we even sit down at the table with them?
No, Sean. Look, in 1956, Khrushchev says, "We will bury you Americans," and 3 years later, he was in the White House with Dwight Eisenhower. You got to talk to your enemies. Ahmadinejad, the former president of Iran, came out and said, "We're going to wipe Israel off the map." It was beer talk.
They've said it doesn't. Pat, that's not beer talk.
He was in office 8 years, Sean, and he's back teaching in college.
You don't believe them? Wasn't that a mistake we made in World War II, that the only person that seemed to really understand the nature of Hitler's ambitions was a guy by the name of Winston Churchill? Wasn't he the one guy that understood that he really meant what he said?
Sean, Ahmadinejad was in power for 8 years. He did nothing. He was a blowhard. Are we going to be frightened by words from some character in Iran?
Pat, what do you mean blowhard? The blowhard that supplied Hezbollah rockets and other terror groups rockets to fight a proxy war against Israel. They're fighting a proxy war now against Saudi Arabia and Yemen. This is all Iran, Pat. What part of this are you missing?
I'll tell you what, Sean. In Iraq, Iran is fighting ISIS and al-Qaeda. In Syria, they're fighting ISIS on behalf of Assad. In Yemen, they're not involved there.
You think that the Iranians are our friends?
Sean, they're not. They're fighting our enemies. I'd rather have Iranians up there fighting in Tikrit and dying than American kids there. And the reason Iraq is in the camp now very much of
So you don't have any problem with the seal of Barack Hussein Obama ultimately being on an Iranian nuclear weapon with their history of being a state sponsor of terror, fighting proxy wars, threatening Israel to annihilate them and the United States. You have no problem with that.
Listen to the American head of intelligence. He says Iran does not have a bomb program as of 2013. Secondly, if they start building a bomb, we will know it. Third, Iran has made some concessions that are not enough that makes them less able to get to a bomb.
Go back to 2012, and we found out they were far more advanced in their nuclear production and program than we ever thought possible. That's what that's what Obama's own government said.
Your friend Bibi's been talking about Iran getting a bomb since 1992. In 2006, he said they'll be building 25 bombs by the end of the decade.
Patrick Buchanan, you don't have any concerns at all about sitting down. By the way, and there's a big difference between the Cold War and the Russians that had nuclear weapons and America paving the way for them to get nuclear weapons, considering, I would argue, that before any negotiations take place, Pat, I'm not against negotiations, but first you have to change your behavior. Stop being a state sponsor of terror. Stop fighting proxy wars. Stop funding groups like Hezbollah and other groups. How's that?
Sean, in Syria, in Iraq, okay, the Iranians and their allies, Hezbollah, the Shiite militia, who are a dreadful bunch, Assad, are fighting ISIS. They are fighting al-Qaeda. The Houthi rebels in Yemen are fighting ISIS and al-Qaeda.
And how ironic that we're serving as their air force in those instances, in large part.
Who are they killing, Sean? They are killing our enemies. They are killing our enemies.
Okay, and then we're also fighting against them in Yemen with the Saudis. So explain that logic to me. How is that a comprehensible
I'll tell you what the Saudis are going to do. The Saudis are making a terrible mistake. If they go in there on the ground, it'll be their Vietnam. When I was a young editorial writer, Egypt went down there.
If the Saudis don't go in there, then they're going to be surrounded by the Iranians, which, by the way, wants to clearly build a huge power for themselves in the region, and that would be more dangerous, as the Jordanians and Egyptians believe.
Sean, the reason there's going to be a power in the Gulf is because your president, George W. Bush, invaded Iraq and turned it into an ally of Iran.
Excuse me, Pat, if you're going to bring it up, point out that the surge worked and Bush's admonition in 2007, if the admonition of keeping intelligence and training troops on the ground were met by Obama, we wouldn't be in this position, would we?
Sean, the reason we're in this position is because Saddam Hussein, a thug, was overthrown, his state was destroyed, his army was broken up, elections were held by Bush, democracy crusade, and the Shia won, and we lost Iraq.
You believe that we can make a deal with the Iranians. You believe peace with the Iranians in our time. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not scared of Iran, for God's sakes. They don't have an atomic bomb.
Now you sound like Obama. Iran is a tiny country. They're not a threat. You believe that?
Bibi's sitting on 200 atom bombs, and he's fretting over Iran, which hasn't even produced weapons-grade
uranium. And this is going to create an arms race that the likes of which the world has never seen before. With one distinction, Pat. Now you're putting nuclear weapons in the hands of radical Islamic mullahs. You really want that? You don't see that as a danger?
The United States could finish off Iran in an afternoon. What are you frightened of, Sean?
Okay. Well, I think it's a bad idea. Just like we finished off North Korea in an afternoon, right,
and I think we can stop it.
I think you're dreaming. All right. Thank you, sir.
I think you're hysterical, Sean.
I'm hysterical. I don't want the mullahs of Iran. I take their words seriously.
I think we can stop
Just like Churchill took the words of Hitler seriously, and Chamberlain thought he could have peace in his time.
How did Britain end up when it followed Churchill's advice?
Well, when they actually won the war. That's how they did.
Won the war. They wound up on American food stamps.
Well,
they lost the empire
and what was their
because
option, Pat, not to fight the Nazis?
No, their option was to form an alliance with France and tell the Germans, if you cross it, you're at war.
All right.
And they wouldn't have had a war.
You're dreaming.
You should read my book. You should read my
Revisionist history, Mr. Buchanan.
War.
I like a lot of what you say, but you're dead wrong here. All right. Joining me now with more. Foreign Policy Initiative co-founder Dan Senor. Who's right?
Wow. Couple reactions. One, Pat's comparison to Khrushchev, the Soviets. I mean, if you want to go that route, that comparison, the truth is the Soviets, as evil as the empire was, they were committed to national survival. It's not clear to us that the leadership of Iran over the long term, I'm not willing to bet that the leaders of Iran will be committed to its own national survival.
Ahmadinejad believed in this ideology of a caliphate in the 12th Imam.
Right. But you either say they're an irrational leadership and they'll take huge risks. They refer to Israel, one of their leaders once referred to Israel as a one-bomb country, meaning you could wipe Israel out with one bomb, and even if Israel responded, Iran was so big they could sustain the response, A. B, if you think that the rational players, as Pat seems to think, they have a strategy in the region, which is they want hegemon status in the region. And we see that with their support for Hamas. We see that with their support for Hezbollah. We see what they're doing in Syria. We see what they're doing in Lebanon. We see what they're doing in Yemen. And now, if they have a nuclear umbrella, what country, Israel, the West, is going to want to take the risk of responding to Iran's provocations if they have a nuclear umbrella? This is terrifying, what he's saying.
Pat dismisses what Israel's destruction is non-negotiable. He dismisses that we're the great Satan and that death to America.
Yeah.
I liken that to those that dismissed Mein Kampf.
Right.
I believe that they are the modern-day equivalent, potentially.
Right.
And with nuclear weapons coupled with radical Islam, I believe you have the potential for a modern-day Holocaust. Tell me I'm wrong.
Former Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, who authorized the military strike against the Osirak plant in Iraq, once said one of his great contributions is what we've learned from Jewish history is when leaders around the world threaten to annihilate the Jewish people, take them at their word.
I agree with you.
They're being serious.
All right, well said. Thank you.